When I rather naively began my involvement, I expected to read a few books, ask a few questions, maybe write a few letters, and I'd have all the information I could ever dream of. I've certainly found some of those answers down the years, but by no means have I found them all. And I remain convinced that sooner or later there would be a crack.
It was just the most incredible piece of film, and yeah, obviously my first impression is this can't be real. An alien autopsy is always going to be the subject of ridicule. Who's going to believe that an alien autopsy is an alien autopsy? It's just a ridiculous subject.
When I got to know Ray pretty early on, it became quite apparent that he had his own agenda for this film. And if you demanded anything of him, then you will be out of the loop. So I decided, rightly or wrongly, to support him in public and in private. I tell him, I thought there was a good possibility the film could be real. However, we'd do all we could to help him research it. But behind the scenes, I was trying my best to find out what was going on. Where did this film come from? I was the press officer for the British UFO Research Association. And in 1993, a letter crossed my desk that would change things forever. And it was a letter from the Merlin Group in London, from a gentleman called Ray Santilli.
Yeah, my name is Ray Santilli. I was never really interested in UFOs or the world of UFOs, and at the time I was involved in a music documentary with Polygram, which is now Universal. And we decided we were going to go on a hunt for Elvis material. So I posted ads in most of the local papers, and we made it known that we were going to be in certain areas at a certain time, and we had cash, and anyone that saw Elvis in 1954, 55, if they had photographs, if they had audio, if they had images of any kind, we were there to buy it. And it was during that trip, we were in Cleveland, Ohio, that we met this cameraman who had probably the first ever footage of Elvis on stage, performing with Pat Boone and a variety of other artists. And then just later on in the day, he came back to the hotel and he asked us if we would be interested in anything else. And then at that time, he told us the story of what happened in 1947. Roswell was not a household name.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
It is claimed that not only a UFO crashed, but there were dead alien bodies. It's rumoured that perhaps one of those creatures on board did survive for a short period of time.
I had to call London and an organisation called Bufora, and I spoke to Philip Mantle. I said, have you ever heard of Roswell? Do you know what this is all about?
You going to mug me? Am I going to mug you?
Is that gorgeous or what, eh?
And I believe I can run a decent marathon.
Thank you very much.
Download Veely now.
After the initial letter, we corresponded some more, and I spoke to Ray Santilli on the telephone. It was quite apparent he knew very little about the UFO subject. So I arranged to meet Ray Santilli in London, obviously a businessman. Music was his main area of business. He obviously knew about that. However, he did go on to mention that he had film of the Roswell UFO crash. Not only did he have some film footage of Roswell, but the actual aliens themselves being dissected, an alien autopsy. My research into the alien autopsy film never stopped.
The story from that point on became quite a roller coaster.
It was always claimed that back in 1947 that film and photographs were taken. Nobody had ever come close to getting a whiff of any film or photographs from anywhere. So I never imagined I'd see anything that was alleged to be from Roswell or even closely related to it. But here we had a gentleman who'd been talking about this for a year and a half, and now we had some film. It was no longer just a rumour or a story. We had some film.
He set aside certain canisters of film which he felt there were problems in processing, and they needed special treatment during processing. The rest he sent straight back to Washington. And when he eventually processed the remaining canisters, he tried and went to great lengths to try and get Washington to come and pick the reels of film up, but they didn't. He kept it in a cardboard box, simple as that, and he kept it in his archive. The question of, well, is it a hoax, then goes back to the incident itself. What he saw was a disc, a flying disc that had crashed. It was on his back. He saw all these creatures that he calls freaks laying outside of the vehicle, screaming in pain for most of it. But he can't tell you where they came from. He doesn't know.
When I saw the film for the first time, he'd opened canisters which had obviously been sealed for a very long period of time. He loaded the film onto a projector. He didn't have a screen, he just slid it against the wall, and I watched what was now known as the alien autopsy on the side of his wall. He just wanted cash. He'd had the film for a very long time, and enough was enough as far as he was concerned. If we had cash, we could take the film away and do whatever we wanted with it. The cameraman at that point was quite disappointed in us for not being able to deliver what we promised.
And Ray flew home to raise the money. He didn't have enough capital to buy it at the time.
There was almost a year or so before I was able to find funding from a third party who was prepared to take a punt. And then we went back to America, cash in hand, and gave the cameraman the cash that he needed.
When you look at the footage, which is all we had to work with at that point, you first look at all the artifacts on the film. You know, is there anything that stands out that would disqualify it, for example? You know, was the surgeon wearing a digital watch? Well, no. When you look at the surgical tools, the clock on the wall, the telephone, they are all circa 1947. There's nothing that you can pinpoint on that film that would disqualify it. The medical instruments looked new, so they didn't look like they'd come from a museum. At the time, you know, I didn't look upon it as being anything other than just a film. You have to ask yourself, okay, we have a film, what could it be? First of all, could it be a hoax? Of course it could, you know. When you look at the movie Jurassic Park, they made full-size dinosaurs, you know, move and look real. So with enough time and money, yes, it could be a hoax. Then we looked at, could it be real? Could it really be, you know, from Roswell? Like I said, it'd always been rumoured that film and still photographs were taken. There was also another idea that perhaps this was some kind of poor, deformed human being that we were looking at. So it was, again, a real film, but it was of some, you know, some deformed person. And there was even another theory, if you like, that could this be some US military disinformation film? Not to disinform UFO researchers, perhaps it was made to fool the Soviets, you know, and leak it into the Soviet Union to say, look what we've got. So there was a number of ideas, you know, as to what it may or may not be, none of which could be proven one way or another at that point.
Philip was diligent in trying to get all of the elements together. We worked with Philip for a period of time when we were trying to decide what to do with the film and how to proceed further forward with it. I think he's gone from total belief into disbelief. You know, and I'm sorry that he's spent 25 years of his life, you know, sort of chasing this story.
Yeah, you've no idea how many times I've looked at this damn film.
Whereas he should just sit back and leave it as it is, because, you know, the film is real, Philip.
My initial reaction was to ask Ray Santilli what his intentions were with the film. Now, at this point, Ray had one idea in mind, and one only, and that was to release the footage as part of a documentary that he wanted to make himself on VHS. So you would buy it via him, maybe through your local high street video store at the time.
What we did in good faith. Yes, we wanted to commercialise it. We decided, after we'd educated ourselves in respect of Roswell and what had purportedly happened in 1947, we thought, well, there's a great commercial opportunity here. And I have to say, our marketing exercise was close to genius, because we put an embargo on the film and we decided to release the film in August of 1995. But what we did was we gave the film mostly free of charge to broadcasters all over the world, and our arrangement with them was to say, look, you investigate the film. We don't care whether you think it's real or not, you just investigate it. The final documentary that you make, we take control of the home video rights, and they could have broadcast rights. What we didn't expect, and it was a surprise, is that just about every broadcaster worldwide came out and said 100% is genuine.
Now, when we get to 1995, there's a fledgling internet in action. And it was probably the first major UFO event to be discussed online. The Alien Autopsy film, as a piece of film, I think is only third on the list to the Zapruder film of the JFK assassination, to the Bob Gimlin film of Bigfoot. And then you have the Alien Autopsy film. And that's how popular the film is, still today.
We had such a roller coaster in terms of meetings, being flown from place to place to explain footage. We realised that it was all escalating, hugely, and the press had been following us and hounding us. We had our homes and our offices and our cars broken into. I had staff leave because they were too frightened, and it did become quite dark. And I purposely kept away over the last 25 years from delving too much in the UFO community. I find obsessive. The energy surrounding them is all negative. And I think that over the years, it's probably done me more harm than good, because I think it's actually interfered with my business as well.
I fully hoped that once it was out in the public domain, that more would be learnt about it. But I was amazed because we learned absolutely nothing. It was a proverbial tumbleweed effect. Nobody came forward and said anything whatsoever. And this film was shown around the world, literally. So I just stuck at it, but initially nothing. So until he promised to give us pieces of film to have analysed and so on, and that never materialised. So you were always suspicious, but he always came up for a reason as to why he couldn't do that, We then showed the film to a number of people in the medical field. Surprisingly, quite a number of them said, yeah, it does look like a genuine medical procedure. It could be, rather than a fully trained surgeon who's done a lot of autopsies, it could be a general surgeon that they've used. And the techniques were fine. When they cut it open in a letter Y shape, which was standard. And they said, but there is no exact rule of how you conduct an autopsy. Everybody has their own ways of doing it. If this was filmed by a military cameraman, there actually was, probably still is, a combat photographers society in the US. So we asked them for their comment. Some said, it's rubbish. I could have done a better job than that. But then others said, well, no, it's not so bad. Because the cameras they used at that point were a fixed lens, you couldn't zoom in. So if you went too close, it went out of focus, like the film does. So their opinion was divided. The skeptics just, said, do what skeptics do and said it's a hoax. Then Santilli released photocopies of labels that were supposedly on the film canisters. You know, the film goes in a canister, the canister goes in a box, and there's a label on it. These are handwritten labels, and there's an official stamp on it. Now, it's a bit blurred, is the stamp, but it looks like the stamp for the Department of Defense in America. It's basically an eagle. I think it's got arrows in its talons, and round the side it says Department of Defense. So somebody said, hang on, this is supposed to be July 1947. The Department of Defense didn't come into operation until September of 1947. Therefore, it can't have been their stamp. Well, you couldn't read the lettering anyway. However, the Department of Defense was the Department of War. They just changed the name. Because you couldn't read the lettering around it, it could have been either. So again, you know, there was nothing we could do to prove that it was a fake. You know, you could speculate till the cows come home. And I'm still adamant that the more exposure the film got, that surely, sooner or later, somebody would come forward and say it's real or it's fake. Now, Santilli was put under a lot of pressure because his so-called mystery cameraman was still alive, according to him. And he even arranged for him to phone me. And one night I did get a phone call from a gentleman with an American accent who claimed to be the cameraman. I couldn't verify it, you know. And then he also produced a interview with him. So you get an elderly gentleman, you know, with a baseball cap on, sat in front of a camera, got a series of questions in front of him, and he just answers the questions. And that was supposedly, you know, the alien autopsy cameraman.
I am the person who shot the film. I will not tell you my name, but I want you to know that I am not happy, that I have betrayed my country. Our United States of America is the greatest country in the world, and I am proud to be an American, and I do not want that to change.
The way I approached my investigation of the alien autopsy film was to try and shake the tree every now and again. And I remained convinced that sooner or later there would be a crack, that somebody would come forward, or Ray would make a slip. Yeah, you know, Ray's story wasn't consistent, but there was no one thing he said that would prove it. You know, he was pulling a fast one, that this was a hoax. It still, at that point, could have been that Ray himself had been conned. But he'd spent a lot of money. He was going to run with it anyway. He didn't really care. So, first of all, we started with special effects. Because a number of special effects guys have been interviewed. They all said we could make it, which I would expect them to say. It's not a big community. There aren't that many special effects artists. So I got the number of one, and I started with him. No, it's not me. It might be so-and-so. We got a number, yeah. So I'd ring the next chap, no, it's not me, but it might be him. And I just kept going around in circles. Tried overseas, got the same results. A special effects company called A Really Dangerous Company here in the States looked at the film frame by frame, and they released a list of what you might call bloopers, you know, errors. But you had to watch the film very carefully. These weren't massive, great things that jumped out and hit you in the face. For example, when they're sawing the head open, the head wobbles. It's not attached. You know what I mean? It's not attached at the back. The head is separate, so they put the hand on the head to keep it still. A little thing about when you look at the body, it's not flat. When you have a deceased person and you lie them on an autopsy slab, all your bodily fluids go with gravity, and the actual your bottom of you is flat as a result. Well, this thing was round, which was consistent with a cast. My wife thought I was going around the twist, you know, watching this thing with their list, and they're telling you where to look. And when you did look, you thought, they're right. So it was only the eye of a special effects artist taking the time and effort to view it like that could have done that. But again, there was no one thing that conclusively proved it was a fake. These were all indications. So I would just keep at it, publish articles, write for the newspapers, talk at conferences. and eventually got a breakthrough. And we got one crack that led to another and to another. And these weren't one after the other, these were a few years apart, but once we got our foot in the door, then, you know, things started to change. When you look at the Alien Autopsy film and how Ray Santilli handled it, either by design or by accident, there's a number of things that actually went in its favour. Now, when Santilli released the film canister labels, parts of it were handwritten, but it also told you on there, for example, what type of film had been used.
Authenticating the film was an interesting proposition, and here are some of the frames of the film itself, okay? And what happened was I decided to take the original film to 2 Kodak offices, one in California and one in London. And we asked Kodak to look at the film and give us a report in writing. Both Kodak offices examined the film. We didn't tell them what was on the film, and they confirmed in writing from both offices that the film was 1947, and that's all I really needed at that time.
Eastman Kodak Company, in trying to distinguish the age of the film, keeps track of the date of manufacture, and this is done through geometric codes. And the symbols on the edge code were a square and a triangle, which were used in Rochester, New York by Eastman Kodak Company to denote the following years of manufacture, 1927 or 1947 or 1967.
There is an argument later, because once Kodak found out that it was supposedly an alien, they said, can we look at the footage again? Can we look at the film again? And knowing that Kodak had American contracts with the Defense Department and so forth, we thought, I'm not going to give them the chance to look at it and debunk it. They've already given us a letter in writing, both offices, that the film is genuine. And it's not my fault if they didn't pay enough attention to, you know, what the image was itself.
According to these labels, this was Kodak's Super XX film. So when you looked up Super XX and you look across in the columns for it, one of the things that it was recommended was for indoors in subdued lighting. What is the Alien Autopsy film? It's indoors in subdued lighting. So even the film stock seemed to fit in. And they even gave you some examples of stills and films to show you what they looked like. And even that was consistent. We had missing bits of the puzzle. I spent in total 14 years researching the Alien Autopsy film. And in 2006, we'd already been given a name, a first name of a gentleman, and the name was Spiros. I knew the film was a fake, I just couldn't prove it. I had a few missing pieces. A colleague of mine called Russell Callahan had a phone call from a gentleman called Spiros Molaris. And he said, Russell said, it's not me you want to speak to, it's Philip. And bang, there was our mysterious man we'd been looking for. And as soon as I spoke to him, he just filled in all the gaps. Game over.
Spiros Molaris is a very talented and very interesting and creative filmmaker. I used Spiros on Alien Autopsy when we did The Investigation Continues, which was a 60-minute documentary based on everything that happened at Roswell. So he was quite involved in most parts of the project. And you know, I know that there's some difficulty at the moment because he's laying claim to coming up with the entire concept of Alien Autopsy and doing everything, but that's absolutely not true. And he was not involved in our trip in America, finding the cameraman, bringing the footage over, and all of that part of it.
All the questions I'd been asking for years, he had an answer for all of them. It's like having a jigsaw puzzle with bits missing. And you had a good idea what the jigsaw was, and once you got the missing parts, that was it. Finished. Spiros was able to back this up. I went to his home, here's my diaries, here's my research files, here's the faxes from Kodak, here's another file of stuff we were gonna do, here's my storyboard, I painted it all. It's 20 or 30 paintings, not scribbles, not little storyboards, I mean full colour. Here they are, you know? And there was paintings of other stuff that he'd done, so you could show he was quite a good artist. You know, here's my diary, meeting with Santilli, you know, everything. So he could, not only could he tell the tale, he could show and tell. So in 2006, you know, after all those years, finally able to conclusively prove, which is what I set out to do, that the Alien Autopsy film was indeed a fake, a hoax, end of story.
However, there was a gap between when we first saw the film and he opened the canisters and when we gave him the cash, and that was about a year and a half. And during that year and a half, because of the way nitrate film deteriorates, a lot of the film had actually just, the image had dissolved away, and as it was going through a projector, it would just peel off. So we had a real dilemma because the film was fast becoming useless. So we had to instigate a campaign to restore the film, which has always been a subject of great controversy.
At some point in the 2000s, I was contacted by a gentleman who claimed to have some information about it. So I met him, and he said, I'm a good friend of a sculptor here in the UK. Wouldn't tell me the sculptor's name. However, before he left the meeting, he let slip one of the projects this sculptor was responsible for. And it was a Channel 4 recreation some years prior called Max Headroom, which was quite popular, and he made the dummy for it.
Who was it said that observing the United States is like watching an epic movie? Oscar Wilde?
Woody Allen?
Max Headroom.
So we checked out who this gentleman was, and he was indeed a UK sculptor, and he was called John Humphreys.
John Humphreys is one of the best makers in terms of prosthetics. He's a sculptor, he's an artist, he's a creative.
Spiros, then and now, went on to tell me that he'd heard Ray Santilli's story about, you know, meeting this fake cameraman and so on. He'd met Ray by chance at a film festival in France, contacted him again when he came back to the UK. Ray Santilli showed Spiros a piece of film. Spiros said, that's never been filmed on celluloid, it's VHS. So Ray told him this fake story about the cameraman and him paying for this footage. So he took off to drive home, did Spiros. And he had this idea, he phoned a friend of his, which was the sculptor, John Humphreys, and told him about this story, and they said, why don't we make him one? i.e., why don't we make him an alien autopsy film? So Spiros went back to Ray and said, if you want an alien autopsy film, you know, we can make it for you. Simple as that. Well, I think Ray Santilli's reaction was, you know, the light bulb moment. It was just a question of the financing. And they had a gentleman who could provide that finance. So, you know, the game was afoot. However, according to Spiros, the game was never to sell the film to make money. The idea was that they would make this film, release it into the public domain, and then at a point, 6 months maybe, down the line, they would do a big reveal and say, we made it, aren't we clever? Look, you know, look what we've done, in the hope that they would then get some more work, because Spiros was a cameraman for hire and had his own little film crew, and John Humphreys was an excellent sculptor, of course. But as we know, things didn't, you know, quite work out like that.
So what we did with the Alien Autopsy footage was a restoration process, and that will always be the area where people will debate. I, with Gary, put together, I think, probably the most expert team of people in cinematic history to put the, you know, to try and restore the images that were missing. When we first had the images of the alien or the creature, we blew it up and said, John, look, can you create this? You know, right down to the wounded leg and everything else. So we copied the set, we copied the creature, we copied absolutely everything. I think what we did was quite faithful to, you know, and so the footage that we've eventually marketed as Alien Autopsy is a mix and match of real and restored. If people say that what we've done is a reconstruction, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them, but I would say that if you bring an artist in, you know, to tidy up Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper and they've repainted over everything, is that, you know, that's the same process really, it just has a slightly different name, but it's exactly the same principle. And I think that's what we did really well. The process of restoration took probably about 3 months.
They were fortunate that Spiros's sister's apartment in London was being renovated at the time. So they could literally build a set in her apartment. It wasn't going to disturb anybody. And off they went. So they designed it pretty quickly and made it and filmed it in a very quick time indeed. Of course, something went wrong. There are 2 autopsy films. It's the same type of creature, the same room. The one that we've all seen on television is a creature laid on a slab, on an autopsy table. There is a doctor and his assistant in a kind of biohazard white suit. There's a window behind them with somebody in a surgical mask behind there. They cut it open, remove various organs, remove the brain. It lasts about 15 or 16 minutes, thereabouts. The other autopsy film lasts a little bit longer, and it is much brighter, and in my opinion, better quality. Only ever saw that once. They conduct a similar type of medical procedure, although there are some slight differences. And that one has never been shown again. It's only been shown to a handful of people. Why that is, you'll have to ask Ray Santilli, of course.
I don't remember showing in 2 versions.
According to what Spiros has told me, the first one, which I've only seen once, one of the medical procedures they conducted was wrong. So if that had been released, it would have been thrown out straight away. So they filmed the second one. They made it, you know, they still got the mould, made another dummy. There was a problem with that. It has a hole in its leg. It was an air pocket. So they improvised. They got some bones from the butchers, put them in, burnt it, you know, and improvised. And it looks pretty good, to be honest.
The creature in the film had black, I can only guess of probably sun filters of some kind. And in the footage that we have, You see it peeled back, and I said to John, "Is there any way we can do?" We had to match that, which he did, perfectly well. The fun item was, organs. Those organs can exist in sort of animals and so forth, and fish and whatever. And we decided, because we're on a limited budget, that he would use some of those as props within the creature.
They put the fake organs in from underneath, so you never see the back of this creature because it's open. The brain of the alien is actually 2 sheep's brains in gelatine, and it's dipped in another material to make it look darker. When it dries, it looks like there's a membrane actually around the brain of this creature.
There was a certain amount of comedy involved as well, because when we had finished the autopsy, we still had to dispose of the dummy. Disposing a dummy is as difficult as disposing a body. We had to cut it up and deposit it across bins in London, and with arms and legs and so forth.
One of the other parts of the alien autopsy film is, again, in a tent, some tables, and it's wreckage, debris, supposedly from the crash. We talked about Marcel and Marcel Jr. seeing these I-beams. Well, they were about this long and about this wide, but in the alien autopsy film, you have their own version of the I-beams, which are much bigger, much wider, and have this lettering on it, again, this strange lettering. And then there are 2 large panels that have hands imprinted into them, as if there's some kind of control panel. So they're all in this tent. And Spiros and John made these. The writing on the I-beams is actually partially Greek, because Spiros is of Greek origin. He speaks and reads and writes the language, and he kind of mixed it up a little bit.
Over the years, apart from the fact that some people have come out and said they may have been involved, the film still maintains its integrity entirely. I think there's no doubt that what happened in 1947 is something that needs to be investigated and people should really take seriously. I don't believe that all the technology that we have today has just come about so quickly by accident. I think there is certainly a degree of reverse engineering that's gone on. If you look at a graph of human development, it's gone like that, and then in the last 60 years, it's gone like that. And I just think that something at that point has happened, and I think Roswell is the start of that story.
It is, without a doubt, the alien autopsy film that we've been talking about is a hoax, and we can prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. However, that's not the end of the story.